A wonderful new year. It's always one of my favorite days of the year because it's a new start, and I expect 24 to be the best year yet. We're doing a lot of work at the Wyoming Secretary of State's office, and I'm just going to roll right into it because I've given this speech in some form, and it takes 40 to 45 minutes. Maybe sometimes I roll in some of the stuff into the Q&A, but 23 has been a very busy year at the Laramie Secretary of State's office. Today at 10:30 a.m., and I did a post about it, is the 1 year mark of having been sworn in as the Wyoming Secretary of State. Thank you for your support in that race, and I hope you can see over the coming 40 minutes or so that we're really working to advance the ball on election integrity and the other areas that fall into our duties and follow through on our promises to the people of Wyoming during the campaign. I want to introduce myself first. I'm Chuck Ray. I represented portions of East Casper in the Wyoming State Legislature for 6 years, and that's how I got involved in Wyoming politics. Was elected in 2016 and entered the legislature in 2017. And did a lot of work. One of the first bills we brought through was the ultrasound bill, which was the first pro-life bill in around 30 years in the state of Wyoming, and led that effort, was the lead sponsor on that bill. We brought that through in the 2017 session, and that sort of set off a wave of pro-life legislation, which culminated in the bill that just passed, the trigger bill, which just is a tremendous moment in Wyoming state history. Unfortunately, we see the other side on this forum shopping and attempting to overturn a bill passed by the popular elected legislature there in Teton County, and please continue to keep that in your prayers because we really need our justice system to have discernment in that issue. Also worked a lot on exporting our coal to markets around the world through the state of Washington. When you look a decade ago, there were plans for 5 or 6 coal export terminals in the west coast of the United States, and one by one, each of those plans basically went broke because the radical left doesn't want us to be able to reach our full potential. And I think that's the big theme here of what we're seeing in Wyoming state politics. You have an ideology, the radical left, that does not want us to reach our full potential as a state, whether it's in the education system, whether it's with our public land. You see them trying to basically lock up all of the public land in southwest Wyoming, whether it's in election integrity, property taxes, these enormous increases, the outrageous Rocky Mountain Power increase. They're trying to price us out and prevent us from reaching our full potential in the areas where we have a competitive advantage. So worked a lot on that effort. Happy to go down that rabbit trail, maybe in the Q&A. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful there. We did pass a bill that Governor Gordon vetoed, and ultimately he did pursue the strategy that we were attempting to put forward in the legislature, but it was kind of a year too late. He waited another year until 2020, and it got caught up in COVID and the end of 2020, and unfortunately it didn't go through because the Trump administration was going to permit it. It was just the state of Washington that we needed to try to bring an interstate commerce clause challenge in the Supreme Court regarding their refusal to permit the facility there in western Washington. But the other effort that I worked on a lot was voter ID. And I just thought it was outrageous entering the legislature that we didn't have a voter ID bill. And this was before election integrity was really hot. We stopped in 2017 and was proud to have done this in the House floor. It was a bill that was thought had a very high likelihood of going through. Governor Meade at the time and Secretary of State Murray were supportive of the effort to move to a mail-in ballot system. And the thought was that they had the votes in the Senate to do it, and we made a stand in the House on third reading and got up there and spoke against it and swung a number of votes and won by 4 or 5 votes in stopping that. And this was before election integrity was really hot. And then I really became interested in taking on the voter ID issue. Filed a voter ID bill in 2018, came up a little bit short on that, filed it again in 2019, came a little bit short then. 2020 came up a little bit short then, and we didn't quite have the county clerks on board, and ARP wasn't on board, but the 2020 election did kind of change that, and I think those groups saw that they needed to come to the table on this effort, and they did, and I commend them for that. So we worked with them on hashing out a bill that we thought would be acceptable, and in the 2021 session brought through voter ID. It was a lead on that as House Bill 75, and I view that as you look back in the last 3 decades, I think one of the landmark election integrity measures that has been passed in the legislature. Buchanan cited it in his press release leaving the Secretary of State's office as one of the hallmark achievements in election integrity during his time. As you know, Ed Buchanan, in a last-minute move, decided last year to apply for a district court judgeship that had come open in Goshen County. That was always his dream, to serve in the district court role. And then a week before the filing deadline, suddenly Secretary of State went open. And I immediately went into prayer mode, sort of set a 48-hour deadline to make a decision, because I did not want the conservative grassroots to split on this. I mean, oftentimes we split ourselves in these races, and I thought it was imperative that whoever the conservative sort of candidate that was going to go against the insider candidate, whoever that was, needed to make a decision quickly. And so did that in 48 hours, and I think we were able to consolidate the conservative vote and came to the finish line on that. It was a tough race, I'll tell you. It's a very interesting race, and happy to talk about that more. Learned a lot, met a lot of people. I really enjoyed campaigning, and unfortunately Laramie County was one of the counties that we came up a little bit short in, but I always thought that, you know, because I'm from Natrona and my opponent was from Laramie, that if in Natrona we sort of made up her advantage in Laramie, that we'd be okay, and we more than did that. So it worked out, and thank you for your support in Laramie County, because it's all about margins. I mean, that's the thing, and I think we ran very strong in Laramie County. I think we overperformed expectations here. So anyway, thank you for your support in that race. Now getting into what we've done in the last year in the Wyoming Secretary of State's office. A year ago when I was sworn in, it was a general session coming up, and that general session convenes in the second week of January. The budget session, of course, which we're in this year, convenes in February. But I wanted to hit the ground running, because I learned as a legislator, the general session is really when you can get these general changes in statute done across the finish line. And that's what we were hoping to do in a number of election integrity measures. Our number one priority was banning crossover voting, which, as a legislator, I can tell you, every year I was there 6 years, we attempted to do. But come short for different reasons each time. One year it got caught up in a Senate committee. One year it got caught up in the Senate floor. One year it got caught up in the House committee. One year it got caught up in the House floor. One year it got weakened so badly that people started to oppose it, because it basically was not an anti-crossover bill anymore. But we made this our number one priority and brought it through the House with a huge margin. And then on the Senate side, actually it failed in committee by 1 vote. And we worked with Senator Larry Hicks to bring a motion to the floor we call it smoking out a bill. It's kind of a colloquialism, but when a bill fails in committee, trying to bring it back to the floor directly. It's a motion that's used rarely, and it should be used rarely. But there are times for it to be used, and in my opinion, this was one of the times when it should have been used, and Larry Hicks brought that motion. We were able to get it back on the floor. And then at the last moment, the media, because they were freaking out at that point, because sort of where they had the votes was the defeated Senate committee that year. But at that point, they had to really scramble, and they started saying that this bill did things that it didn't, that it would prevent new registrants, meaning people that had moved here or people that had turned 18, new registrants after the lockout period when crossover voting is no longer allowed, that it would prevent them from registering and affiliating with the party. That argument was total bunk, and the clerks and I were on the same page on it from the start. We were able to prevent the bill from being amended on the Senate side by one vote, which prevented it from having to go to a conference committee where it could have gotten caught up in some machinations. And then we had a last-minute meeting with the governor because the Attorney General made a pitch to, in my opinion, try to bring arguments that would have led to a veto. And we pushed back on that very hard in a last-minute meeting and explained why those arguments were wrong, and that we would be very public about why these arguments are wrong if they were used to try to justify a veto. And luckily that night, which was the deadline, 11:59, for the governor to make a decision, our founders were very prescient in 1889 when they wrote the Constitution in not allowing a pocket veto by the governor. If a bill passes the state legislature, he has to make a decision. And if he declines to sign a bill, it becomes law in a certain number of days. It's 15 when the legislature's out of session and 3 when they are in session. So he did agree to allow, he called me that night and said, we're going to allow this bill to become law without his signature, and I think it's a landmark moment for our state. This is not a weak anti-crossover bill. This is a 90-day lockout, which the only state that is stronger is Kentucky, where Democrats are not, or either party, you're going to be in the party where you're at. But of course, the problem that we had seen was rampant switch over from the Democrat Party over to the Republican Party, and that's not appropriate. It's not election integrity when you have individuals who are clearly members of one party switching up to the day of the election into another party. So we were able to bring that through and worked with the legislature on that, and I think that was a huge moment. And one thing I'll always say is the empire always strikes back. There was an effort to try to weaken the bill in committee this year, and we were able to defeat that as well. Happy to get into that in the Q&A, but that was an interesting back and forth, and does get in the weeds a little bit into some of the provisions of the bill that are very important, that are at the heart of what it means to have a strong anti-crossover bill. The other thing we did was defeated a bill that would have created a ranked choice voting system in Wyoming, or start to at the municipal level. Ranked choice voting is this very complex deal where you rank all the individuals on your ballot. It's confusing. It leads to it taking an hour to fill out a ballot, up to an hour or more than that. And we ultimately have concluded, and I think there's a consensus in the conservative world across the in conservatism across the nation, that this is not a good development for our nation. And happy to get at the Q&A more, but we were able to defeat that. There have been no efforts to bring that back in this upcoming session. Hope that continues, but I don't think the votes are there for that, and we oppose it in the Wyoming Secretary of State's office. And of course, as a statewide election official, we administer Title 22. We administer the election code on behalf of the state of Wyoming. And the county clerks are the local elected officials that administer elections. So we're sort of a check and balance against each other, which is important. The other bill that unfortunately the governor vetoed in the session was SF 131. It would have prevented these absentee ballot solicitations. Liz Cheney was the most prominent one to do that, where you had a candidate that posed as a county clerk. It's just very inappropriate what she did, and another example of her lack of honesty in sending out these absentee ballot request forms, solicitations, and posing as a clerk. And we attempted to ban that practice in state statute. We brought it through the legislature with strong language. There was an attempt to weaken it, but we added back into the bill some strong language that would have actually put some teeth in it in the House side, and unfortunately the governor vetoed it, citing that strong language, which is unfortunate. Now, that's sort of a slice of life on the session. I want to move a little bit into what we've done on elections in the interim, and of course, when you think about the period in between sessions that's called the interim, that's sort of the colloquialism that is used in the legislature. That's what we're in now, up to when the gavel bangs February 12th and the budget session commences. One of our big
our big ask of the Corporations Committee, which has jurisdictions over elections, was creating what's called a durational residency requirement statute. And it's amazing now to see sort of and we'll get into what's happening on residency in the last few weeks with our rulemaking, but the media now is trying to claim, and the left claim this durational residency requirement as their own when they opposed it here for the last 9 months. It's fascinating to watch. The media is just, and it's one of the themes I hope to bring out in this speech, but I'm not sure I'll fully have time to bring it out. But the media and what they did in our election last year, their dishonesty, it's one of the things in the grassroots world that we're always attempting to combat. When you think about the insider group, I think of it as sort of three sort of heads. I call it a troika. You've got the insiders, the Democrats, and then the media. And they all sort of try to coalesce in creating this narrative to try to prevent conservative actions from going through. When the people, there's a wide consensus for these actions. And they try to work together, and it's just like at the national level. And they get their messaging down and what they're going to say and how they're going to try to defeat conservative efforts. They did that on voter ID, and it's always a fight to the finish here to sort of overcome that. But what we put forward, and this had come to my attention through the clerks, and I immediately thought, hey, we got to go to the committee and get this clarified. We do not have in statute what's called a durational residency requirement for voting. At the time of our founding, the writers of the Constitution, again, were very prescient, and they wrote in a 1-year residency requirement for voting. Over 30 states in the Union had over 1 year residency requirements in their state constitutions. 2 states actually had a 2-year residency requirement in their state constitutions for voting. In a series of decisions in the early 70s out of the Roe v. Wade court, this activist court, one of the decisions they made overturned those durational residency requirements. And there were 2 decisions, one at the federal level, and then there was a companion case at the state level. The Dunn case was at the federal level, and then there was a case called Del Giorno at the state level, not DiGiorno, it's Del Giorno. But it's my favorite pizza. It's better than Jack's. Better than Jack's. But anyway, they struck down these durational residency requirements. And since then, the legislature has declined to act to place a durational residency requirement statute. The implication of this is that you do not need to live in Wyoming, and I don't like advertising this a ton, but it is reality. But there's no durational element to voting, to registering to vote in Wyoming. All it says is that you need to be a bona fide resident. Well, bona fide means genuine. So I posed this scenario for the county clerks. If someone was at a hotel and registered to vote in Wyoming, did not vote in any other jurisdiction, so they did not double vote, they were here for 30 minutes and they checked into a hotel, and if it was ever challenged, they said, look, I had the intent to stay, I viewed myself as a genuine resident, and they pulled out maybe a newspaper or something like that and said, well, I was just interviewing for this job. I had the intent to interview and take this job if I received it, and that's why I was here, and I had the intent to stay. If they signed the oath that they viewed themselves as a bona fide resident, would it be a prosecutable offense? And the answer, unfortunately, was no. Now, I view that as very problematic. And when you have House districts, it's problematic facially, right, in any situation. But even in Wyoming, where you have margins that are so close, I mean, you have House districts all the time where in a primary, Laramie County, some of the House districts that are in areas that don't have as high turnout, you'll have 1,500 votes in the Republican primary where the action's at. 1,500 total votes in a House primary. Well, what's 3% of 1,500? It's 45 votes. That's 3%. All the time races are decided by 1 to 3%. 1% would be 15 votes. When you're 10 miles from the Colorado border and a busing operation would, I'm afraid, not have a statutory approach allowing a prosecution, opposing it, that's really problematic. And you can put forward a lot of different scenarios in our state where that would be problematic. So I asked the Joint Corporations Committee to put in statute a 30-day residency requirement, which over 25 states have. I would like it stronger, I would, and I get it on fishing licenses, hunting licenses. The problem is the federal precedent is that the 30 days is the strongest that survives constitutional scrutiny. And in fact, there was an amendment at the last moment to exempt presidential and vice presidential elections from that. We can go down that rabbit hole, why that amendment was brought. It has to do with the amendments to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The amendments to the 1960 Act that were brought in 1965, there's a provision there that some of the people that aren't as maybe on the same boat as I am on this are citing to say that presidential and vice presidential ballots should be exempt from this 30-day residency requirement. Unfortunately, by one vote, we lost on that. But we did pass the 30-day residency requirement for the other races. And so we're going to attempt to remove that amendment, but also bring that bill forward and remove the weakening amendment. I think that is very important. And it has been fascinating to watch because the media and Wyophile and the Tribune Eagle and the Red Star were so upset when we brought this in April. And the Democrat on the committee voted against it. Well, what I did a few weeks ago, I don't know if you've read about it, but there's been some reporting, is I changed, through our rules, the requirements for registration in terms of proving residency in registration. Now, that is very different from a durational residency requirement. We talked about this in the committee, which is that what's in statute is the attestation, oath, that you sign when you register to vote. The registration requirements have always been in rule, and the clerks have testified, they testified in August that they view that that should remain in rule, and they testified. What the provenance of what I'm trying to do is actually their testimony in August in Douglas, where they said this durational requirement isn't really going to do anything. I'm paraphrasing here, because it's an attestation, it's an oath, and anybody can sign it. It's unlikely to be prosecuted if someone's lying, is the reality. We can talk about that, how we need to get county attorneys that will prosecute these offenses. And that what we really need is some front-end sort of strength on our registration requirements. And they also added in that they continue to view that as something that should be in our rulemaking authority. So I immediately went up to them, because I'm not about talk, I'm about action. I've always been about action. I went up to them, I said, well, let's get this done. And so off that testimony, we started talking about how to put forward a rulemaking that would create a requirement for proving residency at the time of registration. Right now, our registration requires proof of identity, but it does not require proof of residency. So what we're doing is basically requiring both. And there are states that do this, Idaho, Wisconsin. It's very hot right now because this is a problem where you have, some states don't even have durational residency requirements, but if you have a durational residency requirement and you have county attorneys that are Soros elected or whatever, I'm not saying that's Wyoming, but also county attorneys that have a lot of other prosecutions that maybe rise to the top of their priority list. I don't agree with that. I think this should be very high up on the priority list, but that's a reality that you need to have that front end proof. So what we're going to require is that you show some sort of document to provide proof of residency at the time of your registration. Now, this is when you register. If you're already registered, you're on the rolls. Now, if you voted in the last general election, you're not purged off the list. It's only if you don't vote in a general election that you're taken off the list. And you can go to the county clerk a few blocks from here and go on at any moment. And so what we're saying on this, the reporting has been really dishonest, especially in wildfire, where you have this just really reporter that is an activist. That's what she is. I mean, you get on the phone with this Maggie Mullen and sort of the haranguing, and it's just immediate where she comes from. It's not from a sort of neutral position like reporting should be. It's from her political ideology that drives what she's trying to do. If your license has your residential address on it where you're attempting to register to vote, you're fine. That qualifies for proof of identity, it qualifies for proof of residency, and then it also, of course, qualifies for voter ID, which is to prevent voter impersonation. It's a little different from registration. Registration is qualifying to vote, and voter ID is on the back end when you show up to vote. If your residential address does not match your residency where you're trying to register to vote, on your license or whatever document that you're using to prove your identity, which is already in rule, then you're going to have to show some other document to do that. And this is in line with what other states are doing. Utility bill qualifies. I mean, there's 40, 50 documents that we're allowing. I'm happy to add more of them on there as people have ideas, but we really have to ask ourselves, in my mind, voting, we have to have election integrity. And it takes a modicum of effort in order to vote. It's not just a sort of thing, hey, I'm going to show up to Wendy's and, I'm good, it's pass go and I'm there. You have to prove who you say you are, and reasonably, and prove that you live where you say you're living. And I think there's some things we can do to align this a little more with the durational residency requirement in terms of showing proof that you've lived in Wyoming rather than at that specific address, which I think will loosen up some of the requirements. But one of the things we're really trying to touch on here is out-of-state licenses that are being used, because voter ID allows that. That was a concession that fortunately we had to make. I think is a little problematic, but it was something that at that time, but it's a little bit of a weakness in our area, and it gets to the busing sort of scenario. Is that's really one of the things we're getting at. The other thing we clarify in this rulemaking is that if there is any indication on your ID that you are not a legal resident of the United States, in real ID it would be the denotation NR, which is what illegal aliens would receive if they receive a real ID, that is thrown out and not allowed for proof of identity for purposes of registration. So that's what we're doing in our registration rule, and happy to talk more about that. The other thing we did is banning zuck bucks. This is the third-party interference in our elections, where, and if you've seen 2,000 Mules, how many have seen 2,000 Mules? It's a tremendous film, isn't it? And the media, every time when we were running, because we were doing screenings around the state, they come up to me 4 or 5 different times. Like, one was just at a parade, it was a national reporter, like just yelling, going, why are you showing this, outrageous film, blah, blah, blah. I gotta do the Mickey Mouse voice sometimes. And I go to them every time, I go, well, have you seen it? Have you actually seen it? Every single time. And I appreciate their honesty in this respect. They said, no, we haven't. Like, they couldn't bring themselves even privately to admit that they had watched this film because it's outside of their political ideological group. It was kind of interesting to see that. So they don't want to engage with the arguments in good faith. But anyway, in that film, the last third of it talks about how they funded. The first 2/3 are about the drop boxes and ballot harvesting in the swing states and how there was enough margin for the ballot harvesting to swing the entire election. The last third was about how they funded. And what they did, of course, in 2020 is Zuckerberg set up these third-party entities, because he truly is an activist, and put a bunch of money into these third-party entities and called the clerks or recorders across the nation. A lot of states, they're called recorders. And said, hey, we want to fund through this third party COVID-19 mitigation efforts to encourage people to vote. So the funds were supposed to be used for sanitizer, masks, remember those stupid dividers that they use that don't work. And so they were supposed to fund that. Well, only 1% of the funds that were given to local county election officials were used for those efforts. The rest were used for ballot harvesting. So that's how they funded it. And over 25 states in the intervening period after election 2020 have passed bans on this third-party interference in our elections. If you look at the map, almost every single red state other than Wyoming has passed this. Like, this is a slam dunk. We've tried to do this twice. We tried it in the 23 session. Unfortunately, it didn't go through. So I asked the Corporations Committee to bring that forward, and we also sent a letter to the clerks right before that ask, talking to them about this threat and these entities that are doing this. And we had very well researched so the media couldn't call us crackpots and all the names they throw around. And we also threw in a potential Wyoming nexus, because of course that's their other line, right? Does this ever happen in Wyoming? That kind of thing. Like, we can never get ahead of anything, even if it maybe isn't happening. But you can never get ahead of anything. I've never seen this before. Like you can never preemptively stop something that we don't want. It has to happen. And then we have to preemptively stop it. Of course, if it's their stuff, like, changing in statute every single statutory reference to a man, he, him, instead of putting in hers, they want to change every single reference in statute. That, in my opinion, is a waste of time. But I've never seen the media pinpoint that bill as a waste of time. But it's very interesting, what they label as a waste of time. It's always saving lives. They call that a waste of time. The pro-life efforts, they call election integrity a waste of time. But then all the things that are the left-wing deals don't get reported on at all through their selective reporting, and those aren't wastes of time in their twisted view of reality. But anyway, we got that bill through unanimously, banning the third-party interference in our elections. And we threw in the Wyoming nexus, which is there's this billionaire living in Jackson who's a foreign national. His name's Hans-Jörg Wyss. I don't know. My Austrian or my German, I never took that. I guess it's Wyss, but it's spelled Wyss. But anyway, he lives in Jackson. He's a Swiss billionaire. And he's one of the guys who has set up these third-party entities. Not only has he set up these entities, for him, it's also a way to get around the federal prohibitions on foreign nationals contributing to American elections. So there's multiple sort of angles of problems with that, and I also alerted the clerks to that as well. Let's switch here to the outrageous efforts to try to remove Trump from the ballot, which we're taking on. So I've been sued, and I want to clear up. I get a lot of questions about this graphic that's on Fox News and Newsmax. Why is Wyoming colored in this effort, this outrageous effort to try to remove Trump from the ballot? Well, the reason Wyoming is colored in, what they're talking about with that graphic is all the states where there's some pending action to try to do this. And I've been sued in my official capacity by this radical attorney, Tim Newcomb from Laramie. I called him a madman the other day because he is a madman. If you look at his filings, he's filing pro se. He's not even making sense, his arguments. Like, it's the ramblings of a madman. And one person, because I certify the ballot, one person sued me in that capacity to try to get a judge to order me not to certify the president. That's why we're colored in. It's nothing that the state's doing. It's nothing that, of course, I'm doing. We're fighting it. We have filed a motion to dismiss, and the campaign has filed a motion to intervene as well, which they do in every state where there has been a challenge. So has the Republican Party, the state Republican Party, and we're very supportive of that. We made that clear in our motion because we believe that the campaign should also be able to, Trump should be able to defend himself. But we've been on this from the start. one of the things we did in August when this talks was ramping up, we sent a letter to the New Hampshire Secretary of State. We were the only Secretary of State in the nation to do this, because he was saying that he was flirting with trying to remove Trump from the ballot in New Hampshire. And we said, this is wrong. We have an interest in Wyoming. Of course, the media always says, well, why is this in your duties? We have an interest in Wyoming because it's wrong. It also affects momentum in the primary. If Trump loses momentum by not being able to appear in the New Hampshire primary, that affects all the succeeding caucuses and primary states, which includes Wyoming, because we're a caucus state that comes after. And then, of course, we're affected if he's not able to be eligible to attain presidential electors, because that affects other states in terms of their election systems if he can't attain electors from that state, because it reduces his ability to reach the 270 threshold, and that affects everybody. So we have a clear interest here in Wyoming. It's another example of the media trying to bring forward a mantra that isn't in line with reality. So we sent a letter to the New Hampshire Secretary of State asking him to drop this effort. He did ultimately. He sent me kind of a note. He was upset that we did that, but a week later he said that, and I'm not saying it was just because of that. I mean, there's a lot of people saying that, but we contributed to that effort. And then also we filed an amicus brief in Colorado when that effort came to the Supreme Court. We saw this coming. When that trial judge issued that outrageous 95-page finding, remember, and then she spent 5 pages sort of saying, well, he's not an officer of the United States if you look at the plain text of the 14th Amendment, which he's not. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have a president be an officer of the United States. There's very clear case law on that. We can get into that. But when they had that 95-page finding, they knew it was going to be appealed. So with that finding, all that needed to happen was the Colorado Supreme Court reverse that legal interpretation in the last 5 changes, and that finding would stand, and then they could remove him. So that's why we filed that amicus, saying that this should have been dismissed from the start. This is a kangaroo court. This is wrong, because we really did see that coming. We led that amicus effort with 2 other secretaries of state signed on, one from Ohio and one from Missouri. And of course, at the time, the media said, well, why would he do this? This is silly, blah, blah, blah. And then it, of course, was vindicated. And we're going to be filing a motion, an amicus here in the Supreme Court, very quickly, asking them to grant cert for the appeal that is coming this week. Of course, the party, Colorado Republican Party, filed an appeal last week, but President Trump is filing an appeal this week, and we're going to be filing an amicus asking for cert in the Supreme Court, because this should be reversed. We also processed the initiative to limit property tax through a homeowner's property exemption. I'm sure you've heard about that. Very important effort. Worked a lot on property tax reform, putting a cap in statute when I was a legislator. We saw this coming. Brought a bill in 2021 that would have been a 3% cap, and now there were 23 bills in the last session reforming property tax. Well, in 2021, when we brought that bill, it was 1. And so we saw this coming, and it's very important and conservative that we have people that are thinking in the future. And I think this effort to bring forward an initiative is very important. It's another prescient provision in our state constitution, which is that citizens can bring forward changes in statute when nothing's happening in the legislature. And I'm afraid on property tax reform, very little has happened. You can talk about the refund program, and the governor always lauds that, but that really is very limited. And we need broad-based reform on property tax. And I think I commend the group that is bringing this through the initiative effort, and we certified that. Really quickly here, we do other things other than our election division. Our business division certifies all business entities in the state of Wyoming. It's actually it's our largest division. We are up over 30% in the last year on this, countering sort of the narrative that, remember the media said everything was going to fall apart when we entered office. 15 months ago, they were saying that in their articles, and we're up 30%. And we're not asking for a ton of new staffing. We do have a request of the Appropriations Committee to become more efficient with our software, and that could potentially turn into a staffing issue, but we're not doing this 8-person increase that they were talking about last year. We're up 30%, and it's because we're efficient, our fees are low, and we grant privacy, which is something we need to watch. I think on the margin, we need to improve our statutes in that way. There is some evidence that our business entities are being used by Russian and Ukrainian, foreign Chinese entities as a tax shelter or shelter for other purposes. And I haven't seen one Wyomingite that says that they want our business entities to be used in that way. So that's something I'm going to ask the Corporations Committee to take up in the interim. We did that for 23, but unfortunately they did not take it up there. We're hoping in 24 to move the ball on that. We also have moved the ball in our compliance division. We regulate stockbrokers, broker-dealers, investment advisors. And one of the things I wanted to do, I was sitting, I watched this anti-ESG bill go down in the session. And it's the third time the legislature has rejected these anti-ESG bills. ESG is a woke clown show. It's an effort to attack our coal, oil, gas, ag industries, trona, prevent us from reaching our full potential. And we on both angles, in both boxes where we have the ability to move the ball on stopping ESG, we're doing that. Through our regulatory authority over stockbrokers, broker-dealers, investment advisors, we brought forward a rulemaking to require disclosure if any of those entities are selling to Wyoming investors an ESG product. And the idea there is these products are not profit maximizing. And what the left is trying to do with this ESG is turn on its head over a century of case law, going back, even more than a century, going back to the English common law, what it means to be a fiduciary, which is that your stockbroker is pursuing a profit maximizing objective, period. And they're trying to turn that on its head with this sort of social investing and anti-coal investing. So we said, look, if someone's going to do this, they have to disclose it to their Wyoming customer. And there are disclosures, hundreds of disclosures that they have to do. So this is part of the course. We went through a comment period on it. There was very little opposition, but now, unfortunately, the Management Council has a memo before it. They're talking about opposing this rulemaking, and it does have to go to the governor's office now for signature. So that's something we're working on, and happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. We also just submitted a letter to the post office opposing this effort to move mail to Colorado, the processing of mail. I'm very concerned about the election implications of this. Now, we do believe they are going to give assurance that it will not affect election mail, but I'm against it, from word go. But I also think that the idea that they're going to be 100% in preventing election mail from going down there, if that's the norm, it's hard for me to believe. It's a human enterprise, and there are going to be mistakes, and I just think we should keep it up here for a variety of reasons. I'm going to save sort of the board efforts for the Q&A. I think I've talked for about 43 minutes, which, I think 45 is a good cap, and maybe I'll throw in some of this stuff on what we're doing, because we also sit on the State Board of Land Commissioners and the State Loan and Investment Board. All the statewide do, and talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A maybe. But let's open it up, and then we can have a good back and forth here, a good colloquy on some of these issues. I'm excited to hear about. Oh, by the way, if you want to sign up for any of our emails, I got a sign-up sheet on the back. I don't have a pen. If somebody does have a pen, I'd appreciate it if they did put it back here. And then my card. You can call me 24/7, 365. That's my cell on there after the C, so there's no intermediaries. That's direct to me, and would love to have you in the Capitol, sit down with you, talk about your hopes and dreams for our state. And being here in Cheyenne, I invite people every time give a speech, invite people when they're in Cheyenne to come to our office, but being in Cheyenne is very convenient. So we'd love to have you in our office, so please take one of those cards as well. Thank you.
Other people might want to.
Yes, yes.
Why, pray tell, do we have to have a 90-day moratorium on crossover voting? I believe that, because the election judges, and many of us have discussed this, the election judges are going to be the ones that take the heat, not you. How are the county clerks going to educate the public? What we've concluded in just conversations in the past is 30 days would be more than enough. People don't even think about voting or crossing over, not even 30 days. If someone grows up and wises up and says, you know, I think I want to be a Republican, then we welcome them to our party. But they have to get that knowledge 90 days before they even know who's fighting for office.
Well, I appreciate your point of view. I respectfully disagree, and I think a majority of the legislature has spoken, and I think this crossover voting can really decline voter confidence. I think the idea that somebody could change to the Republican Party at the polls and then switch back on the way out, be a Republican for, 15 minutes, just to vote in the primary is really problematic. And I think a 90-day lockout is tied for the strongest in the nation other than Kentucky. It survives constitutional scrutiny. Kentucky's got, I believe it's about 6 months. And I think it's a basic election integrity measure. I always go back to, Hamlet, to thine own self be true. And this thing where you've got people crossing back and forth, I don't think it's consistent with a system of integrity. So.
Totally disagree.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's great. That's
And I will talk to my legislators.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't make sense. The public is not going to know about it.
Well, there are all sorts of statutes that go into effect that interact with the public, and so
You're not going to take the heat. It's the election judges that are going to, because
Well-
people will be outraged if they wised up and decide to become a Republican. And the judges will all tell you that crossover voting is a problem, and it's a nightmare. I found out the other day that some of the judges actually participate in it and encourage it. Now in Laramie County, they don't get to switch right back. We tell them the computer system does not accommodate 2 changes in one day. But we would love you to have you change back to your Democrat status. You'll just have to wait for 1 week and go down to the clerk's office. None of them do it. Because they're not gonna, if it was 30 days, they wouldn't go to the clerk's office and change.
well, some counties have not allowed the switchback. You're right on that. Most have. Some have said that it's inconsistent with their system. I believe that interpretation, and I don't agree with this interpretation. I believe it's inconsistent with state statute, and there's a number of things that I've had a vibrant conversation with the clerks that I'm not sure jive with the plain reading of state statute before crossover vote passed, the crossover voting ban. But most counties have allowed the switchback immediately, and so that I think is even if it's a day. I think it's problematic. You have to have at some point a lockout period, in my opinion,
And 30 days is
Well-
more than enough, I'll guarantee it.
Yeah, and that amendment was brought and defeated. I think 90 is the way to go. But, yeah.
Just a
Yeah.
comment, just a comment.
Uh-huh.
When I moved 25 years ago, I left Laramie and I moved to Colorado. It was predominantly, Arapahoe County was predominantly Republican. By 2015, that had already turned around, it started 28. And we lost the majority. It got, so it was a third, and finally it was mostly Democrat. But in that switchover voting, Blueprint of Colorado, which showed how these 5 people turned it all around in Colorado. One of the things was to go in and select in the primary the most mediocre candidate in the Republican Party, then switch back, and of course, then because a lot of Republicans would simply say, well, that person's not conservative enough for me, so I'm just not gonna vote. Now, this is what I heard because I was working in gubernatorial candidacy at the time. So, you know, that, the nastiness, if you will, and the skullduggery that these radicals will perform will amaze you. And this YO file, which I do read just to see what they are saying, you gotta know there's a lot of activity afloat here with the influx of population that Wyoming has experienced. And we can hang on to the way we do things while the world passes us by if we don't, you know, realize the strategies that they play while we sit back and be nice. So I'm just, you know, and we saw what happened, not a lot. It could have been worse with Liz Cheney, but it wasn't. But nonetheless, the over voting is a strategy, and yes, they will implement it. And so, you know, maybe the judges and things like that, it's again, just be, you know, we welcome Republicans, and those who are truly bent on being a Republican will stay. But there are those who are.
And I have never ever questioned whether crossover is good or bad. It is bad, and it has been a factor in our elections. 90 days is too much, 30 days is plenty, is my position.
Yeah, well, whatever, but I'm just saying I've seen it in action.
Yeah, I was a judge, an election judge, and I watched people come in, and they changed over from Democrat to Republican, voted, came back and changed again. And there was nothing we could do. You're either Republican or Democrat, so you should know that by election day.
Right.
So I think that
But they also have their games.
I know.
They do, yeah.
Well, and one question, Michelle, if you just, I want to respond to one of your points on that WIO file. It's very important to pinpoint the tactics. And you talked about that blueprint book in Colorado, which is a very important thing for us to study up here in terms of the conservative movement and understand what they try to do. But this WIO file is very sinister. It's backed up as basically a tax write-off for activists. It is not, it's funded by activists, it appears, and these papers now that can't hold on to people, basically what they do now is they hire the most left-wing reporters, editors. There's this guy named Josh Wolfson who moved over there.
Gary Drake.
Yes, and then what has happened recently is the papers have started syndicating, picking up the WIO file stories. They do it for free. So this entity that is paid for by what appears to be liberal activists as a tax write-off, probably, then produces this basically mouthpiece stories for the left that then go out on the Wyoming News Exchange and get picked up by these newspapers that can't fund having actual reporters anymore. And if they do, they're also left-wing. I mean, the Red Star vacancy has been up for over 45 days. It's amazing if you look on it. Guess what the annual salary is on?
$30,000.
It's 40 grand a year. And it's been up for like over 45 days, and we'll just tell you about this. So what they're doing is they're picking up all these, there's another called Wyoming Truth. What are these things? They have no income. And then
Not
they,
even Wyoming people.
Right.
I looked them all up.
yeah. And, remember, I don't want to get too into this, but the tactics they use, when I was in the primary last year, 2 weeks before the election, basically the insider group had a former Secretary of State, Max Maxfield, file this bogus complaint saying that I had taken straw donations, which is a felony, through a federal campaign account I had. No evidence. I get a call at 4 p.m. because I told people, they were like, Chuck, people were saying, you're ahead. I told them, no, they'll do something in the last 2 weeks, you watch. They always do this when a conservative's ahead, always. 2 weeks exactly before the election, remember before the Red Star stopped printing on Wednesdays, the Wednesday and the Sunday versions were the most printed, most read. And Wednesday led with a news headline, whereas Sunday led with a feature. So if they're going to drop a negative news headline, it's most advantageous to do it on Wednesday, right? So I get a call, I'm on my way up to Newcastle at 3:45 p.m. from this reporter, quote unquote. Hey, have you seen this complaint that's filed against you by Max Maxfield? I said, no, because the FEC, that's the venue for the complaint, they have to send it back to you, and like 24 hours have passed. So what this guy had done is maybe through another person, they had illegally leaked it to the media. I hadn't even seen it. And they tell me, hey, you've got an hour to respond, we're printing a story about it. Top of the fold. And then I'm vindicated on a unanimous decision by the Federal Election Commission, which has Democrats on it as well. Unanimous decision, 7 months later, I have to pay attorney, same thing that we see, much more advanced from what they do to higher up figures. But this is the tactics they use. Meanwhile, actual violations of statute by insiders will never get printed. If it does get printed, they spend 75% of it trying to make it seem like we're nasty and it's all wrong and blah, blah, blah. It's just incredible what they do. So I encourage you, I'm not saying don't read it, but please, everything they say. And look, at Cowboy State Daily, they oscillate a lot. Occasionally, you have a really good story that is fair. Really, I think for 2023, sometimes you have a story that's fair, and then one that isn't, but just in general, just please read everything with and you've got my cell now, so if you have any questions, just give me a call. Michelle?
I was just going to ask you, in the last couple of years, we've had a real problem getting election judges throughout the state. And the governor has allowed state employees to take the day with pay to go and meet election judges for the primary and the general election. I don't know if the general public really knows that. That, he sends out a memo saying, hey, we're having a problem getting election judges across the state. If you want to be an election judge, just let your whoever you work for, your agency know. And I'm just wondering if you're anticipating, especially because I do think that they are going to be the frontline recipients of some of this anger and hostility. And a lot of them, quite honestly, a lot of times these people who are retired that are octogenarians and older that are doing this as volunteers. Do you anticipate that we're going to have a difficult time recruiting election judges under these circumstances again this year? And secondly, have you talked to the county clerks at all about security? When we have to have security for school board meetings, it might not be a bad idea to at least put local entities on an awareness or an alert that, it would be really nice if we had police that would randomly, just stop by and see how things are going at voting polls. I don't know, I just think that there's a possibility that it could become a little crazy.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think there's a lot of ideas there that we need to, I talk with the county clerks all the time about security at the courthouse and at the polling place. We're actually doing a review right now, or there's a review being done on their ballot processing security and the actual security around the ballots. One of the bills that did pass in 2021, which I did not vote for as a legislator at the time, and I am not thrilled about,
allows counties to open absentee ballots early, meaning that they are open in the courthouse for a period of time overnight, which I do not like. I think there's a lot of problems with that. Opening and doing a pre-processing without running it through the machine. I mean, anyway, I don't even want to go down that
Well,
rabbit
especially
hole,
when you
but-
may not have somebody there to watch the opening, right? I mean,
Right.
from each party.
But I certainly think there's a lot of things there, and that's, I need to, yeah, those are a lot of good ideas there.
Anyone else? I have a question.
Yeah.
Since the 2020 election, I know of one state who reached out to its surrounding border states to see if they could get information on voters, because they thought they were having a lot of problem with busing in voters. Is that something that Wyoming has considered doing?
That's something that we have considered entering into MOU state by state with voter sharing agreements. We have never been a member of ERIC, which is a voter sharing agreement system that was worked out. Most of our surrounding states are not. The board was kind of taken over by sort of a leftist activist influence, and frankly, most Republican states are withdrawing from ERIC. Mississippi withdrew, Missouri withdrew. Wyoming has never been a member. But I think what has been hot in the Secretary of State community world is entering into state-by-state MOUs that would allow for voting sharing agreements to watch double voting. But I'm not sure that's going to really affect busing. I mean, unless you're having a double vote, with busing. But I'm not sure maybe they are cavalier enough to do that. But double voting is flat out prohibited. That facially there is very clear. Now, whether there be a prosecution from the county attorneys, that's something we're working on, getting more, stronger action by the county attorneys in some of these areas. But I think voter sharing in terms of that double voting is something that's the original intent of ERIC, and that's the part that I think there's a wide consensus about. And that's certainly possible. Someone would bus somebody in and they would double vote. You would think, though, that they would probably just have them vote in one jurisdiction, but bus them in and overcome the weakness in our residency requirement. And that, I'm not sure voter sharing really solves that issue. But you're right on double voting. Voter sharing is, and we have looked at doing some MOUs. I've talked with a lot of people on it, and I'm a little bit, there's a lot of evidence of doing, there's a lot of, hesitancy with some aspects of that. And I'm curious on your feeling on it. I mean, I want to do the right thing for the people of Wyoming. I get feedback on that. I mean, are people comfortable with doing vote sharing in surrounding states? I think there are a lot of advantages to it. The problem is when you get a situation like ERIC, where you get a board that appeared to be using the data for partisan purposes, and that it got a black eye because of that, what happened with ERIC, which Wyoming was never a part of. So there's been this working group convened by the Secretary of State in Ohio, is kind of leading it, to work out a master MOU that other states would be able to do. But I've heard a lot of hesitancy on it. And so I'm happy to engage with you. I mean, the MOU would be strong, but how do you really know it's being complied with? It's not easy. It's kind of a trust thing. And people justifiably have lost trust in their institutions. I mean, I tell our guys in the office every day, I've learned this over being involved in Wyoming politics over a decade. I think the number one thing that I can do and we're conservatives here, I think. I think we should be skeptical of our government. But justifiably, people have lost any inkling of trust, and it's totally justifiable. What I hope to bring, one of the things I hope to bring is the one light that people can see, this is someone that has the right intent. and may not get it right 100% of the time. I'm not perfect, nobody is, but somebody that really is trying to, be honest in the way I do my job. But of course, the media is always trying to prevent. It's very fascinating. The number one thing they try to attack me on is they always attack me on the veracity of my statements. Because they know that that trying to get people to lose that trust, that's a key weapon they have. So I'm nervous. I've thought a lot about this and want to get feedback on that in terms of where people are at in terms of that vote sharing, because it would be shared with the SOSs in those other states. And I don't look. The Colorado Secretary of State, we've seen what they did on this Trump thing is just outrageous. And she did, while she may have not been the actual party by the end of the claim, she really did nothing to stop this outrageous effort. And so that's the main one we do, right? I mean, but in addition to our neighboring states. And so it's something I'm grappling with and happy to get feedback on. But I have no intent to join ERIC. That board has been taken over. There are so few participating states now. None of our neighboring states might be, I think Idaho would true too, but they might still be in it. But the southern states are totally out pretty much. I think Florida's still in it. They want to get out, but there's a statute that requires them to stay in. But this MOU effort is happening sort of on the side.
Yeah, I don't like the idea.
Yeah.
So I just was curious.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate that feedback. And anyone that wants to provide, go ahead.
Oh, I just have another different question, if you're done talking about it. Can you explain about that fire district, the election that they had?
Yes, thank you.
And how that all worked, and I never heard it.
Thank you.
Before.
Well, I want to be very clear on this. These off-year elections, in the legislature, I oppose the expansion on these off-year elections. We saw this coming, and I continue. I hope one of the things that maybe comes out of this is a statutory change. Representative Stivar has taken this on hugely, since 2020, as the legislature opened up this statute and allowed off-year elections for all sorts of things. What happened there is, first of all, it really did go through the clerk's office. Those special district elections, the clerk, and I know Clerk Lee, I want to be very clear here, she has said that she had nothing to do with it, but the statute grants her the discretion to go in and run that election. She made the call to allow the entity to largely run that election. And so, I think that is, her answer needs to be, I think there's a sentence that needs to be added there. And I'm not saying there's any bad intent, but I do think there needs to be a clarification, an added sentence on what was said. I know, Michelle, I was hearing that you had delivered that, and that's fine. I have not, but the statute is very clear that she has the ability to take over for the entity and chose not to do that. I really think these off-year elections should be very limited. I think county-wide stuff, I don't even like that. The county-wide stuff has seemed to somewhat work. The Platte had a county-wide. Laramie has had county-wides in 2022. Natrona had a county-wide. The turnout is not as high as a primary or general or anything of the sort. But when you get to where this is a portion of a very populated county, first of all, it's very confusing. It poses a messaging challenge because it's like a sixth of the voters of the county, if that. And so there's a messaging challenge in actually messaging who's eligible to vote in this thing. When you get a portion, especially of a populated county, it's very confusing quick. The challenge is that we want to have the ability for special districts to do routine business in an off year. most of these special districts are like water districts in rural areas, a few homeowners that band together to deliver water to their property. So how do we separate out that from what we saw in Laramie County? I think there's some things we can do, but the statute's written in a broader stroke to allow a lot of these off-year actions. And so it just doesn't work in a portion of a populated, it does not work. There's mass confusion as to who's eligible, and you get what you had there, which is a 6 to 7% turnout. I think one way to, and other states have done this, is to just have some sort of statute that says if you don't attain a certain turnout level, the election is null and void. And whatever that level is going to be, I think that's one way to handle this, rather than get into which special districts are eligible, which ones are not. I think if you have that blanket turnout provision that touches on it, I think it's one of the cleanest ways to do it, and one that could actually proceed through the legislature in its current makeup. I'm for rolling this back to pre-2017 levels. I mean, where there were a lot less possibilities for off-year elections. Yes?
I was just gonna say, Chuck, I think a lot of that boiled down to, and talking to Deborah Lee and at an elected officials dinner recently, that it really boiled down to cost. And so, there's a cost with every election, and so when we do like a special purpose tax, there's a cost to put on a 6-penny ballot. And there was a cost to put on that election, and that entity evidently didn't have the money or didn't want to spend the funding to pay the county clerk's office to go in and run that election, which by my understanding would have been about $38,000. And so consequently, they chose not to have the county clerk do that. And so I agree with you. The off-year elections, I would like to see them completely gone, but there are entities that need to do business.
Yeah.
So having some sort of a threshold, I think, might be the answer. And the county has to be able to recoup their cost, I get that. But sometimes the cost of an election in an off year is, it's not attainable by small entities.
Yeah. Well, and my response to
I was
that,
gonna say, the cost of a lot of this is bigger than that. It is the trust in this system when
Yeah.
it goes bad like this, and that's a huge cost.
Yeah.
and everything's a balance, you're right. And one of my other responses to that is, I believe the way the statute's worded, I will triple check on this, but I'm 95% sure the way it's worded, that if they said we can't afford to have the clerk run it, she could have said, well, sorry, I choose to run it, and if you can't afford it, then we're not holding it. And then it could have rolled into a general primary ballot next year, and some entities do have business that has to get done. I'm not sure this was one that couldn't have waited 9 months down. I certainly don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. I'm not talking to the fire district people. Maybe it was something that posed an emergent thing, but my impression reading it is they could have waited till the general of next year to do that. Within a year.
So, Mr. Gray, we
Yep.
need to get on with our meeting.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
Call me anytime. Thank you.